Hey YouTubules, welcome back to the new show. I'm Random Rob. Today I want to take a look back at a classic animated fantasy film from 1982, The Secret of Nimh. The movie was based on Robert C. O'Brien's 1971 children's fantasy story, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh. And O'Brien had offered the book to Disney in 1972, but was turned down. Now, in the late 1970s, a small group of independent-minded animators who worked for Disney, led by Don Bluth and his associates John Pomeroy and Gary Goldman, were working on a side project while they were at Disney called Banjo the Woodpile Cat, and had tried to get upper management to look at the film to see if they might want to finance turning it into a feature, which Disney was not. Around this time, Ken Anderson, who was another associate of Bluth's, he was an artist and a story writer, was reading Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh, and for the second time brought it up to a head of production to see if Disney might be interested in the story. And the response he allegedly got was that, "We already have one mouse, we just did The Rescuers, no more mice stories." Anderson also showed the story to Don Bluth, who thought it might be a good book to make an animated movie out of. Bluth, Pomeroy, and Goldman eventually left Disney in 1979, taking 8 animators with them. And they opened Don Bluth Studios, which originally operated out of Don Bluth's house and garage for the first 2 months they were active. They eventually moved into a 5,500 square foot, 2-story building in Studio City, in California. And around this time, a James Stewart, who was another ex-Disney man who had started his own production company called Aurora Productions, who had also been talking to Ken Anderson about Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh, acquired the rights to the book, greenlighting the film for Bluth's untried production company with an initial budget of $5.8 million and a completion time of 30 months. And it should be pointed out, for a feature-length film to be made by a small group of animators like this for that amount of money and that amount of time was unheard of. They worked on the film from January 1980 to June of 1982. As production was getting near completion, they realized they were still about $1 million short of what they needed to complete the film. So Bluth, Goldman, Pomeroy, and the executive producers for Aurora Productions all mortgaged their homes to complete the film. And that makes me want to make a note. I want to come up with a list sometime of film producers who mortgaged their homes or sold their homes to make their movies happen, because I think that would be a very interesting list. It would include films like The Ninth Configuration by William Peter Blatty and Eating Raoul by Paul Bartel. Now, the film ultimately would have a staff of about 100 animators and artists working on it. And these people were very often taking their animations home with them at night to work on. They were often working without pay. Bluth ended up offering, I think, all of the artists a cut of the profits since they were not able to keep up with paying them. And this is noteworthy because although films in the past had been made where members of the creative staff of the film were offered percentage of profit in lieu of a paycheck, this had never been done with artists. And my main reason really for wanting to talk about The Secret of Nimh today, I think it's a film that, if you compare it to other animated films or more modern animated films, you still wouldn't understand what a departure The Secret of Nimh was as an animated movie when it came out. For one thing, you have this strong female character as the lead, who's a widow. She's like a working class mom. You know, she's not a queen, she's not a princess. There's nothing really special about her except her courage and her faith, really. Another thing that was different about The Secret of Nimh was the amount of classic film technique that went into it. Don Bluth felt that Disney was cutting costs and abandoning traditional animation techniques in favor of whatever was the cheapest way to get something done. So one of the techniques he used a lot in The Secret of Nimh is rotoscoping and doing multiple passes of frames with a camera so that you could create sequences that would seem to have more realistic light sources and more realistic depth of color depending on the lighting of the scene. Mrs. Brisby herself in the film had, I believe, 42 different lighting solutions depending on what was called for in the scene. And again, it might be something, if you casually look at this film, you might not notice the attention that went into realistic daylight and shadows. It looked a little darker, it looked a little more realistic. It had more realistic themes. Secret of Nimh gets into experimentation on animals, animal cruelty, and this idea of these overlapping communities of animals in this sort of loose Venn diagram that all come together to help one another when they're threatened by the presence of human beings. Again, this is very different from Walt Disney pictures of the period, where animated animal characters would live in magical places where real-world problems did not intrude. Secret of Nimh is a talking animal picture, but feels very much rooted in the real world. The focus on realism extended into the animations of the characters. Many of the animators took movement classes and dance classes to get them into the headspace of these animal characters. Like, how would an anthropomorphic rat actually walk around? And I always think that detail is fascinating. Bluth really wanted his animators to think about, like, you're not just drawing this rat, you are the rat. Try to give it its own individual character. And my favorite bit of realism that this film indulged in is really where you can see the clearest difference between The Secret of Nimh and other animated films of the time, is the dialogue is very naturalistic. And when I say very naturalistic, I mean this is the first animated movie I remember ever seeing where the characters weren't simply delivering lines, they were actually speaking how people would speak, including occasionally stuttering or clearing their throat, or maybe pausing because they were doing something with their hands. And it's just, as someone who loves film, I can't help but appreciate that level of detail, especially in an animated film, because it's not something you would think to notice right away and then be like, oh yeah, she actually stuttered, she actually said a word twice there, and they animated it, they had her clear her throat, they had her cough. Just very different from what Disney was doing. And you could not have better voice actors for this kind of material. Elizabeth Hartman as Mrs. Brisby, she has this wonderful quality of heartbreak whenever she delivers any of her lines. Dom DeLuise, of course, is goofy and zany. Derek Jacobi, who had previously worked on I, Claudius, gives Nicodemus this wonderful otherworldly quality. Paul Shinar as Jenner is wonderful. His line deliveries they're just terrific. What's the one line he says when his buddy says to him, Jenner, you can't kill Nicodemus, and Jenner says, no taste for blood, huh? They've taken the animal out of you. It's just great stuff. And in addition to that, you have an orchestral film soundtrack by Jerry Goldsmith. And again, the watchword here is adult. The musical cues in this movie are very serious. Some of them are very intense and scary. It's a really epic sounding film. And the adult sort of intensity of the Goldsmith score, again, gives this film a very different feeling in the fight scenes or in the chase scenes. A scene, for example, like where Dragon the cat comes across Mrs. Brisby and Jeremy the crow and attacks Mrs. Brisby. This is a scene that in a Disney movie would probably be played partly for comic relief, but in Secret of Nimh, it's a terrifying scene. When the tractor is coming towards Mrs. Brisby's house and she's trying to figure out a way to stop the tractor, the choices of shots that are used and the music and the action is intense and frightening. I still choke up during those scenes when I watch this movie. I first saw this film on VHS when I was 14, and it blew me away. This year I'll be 52. This movie still blows me away. It's so small, it's so humble, but it's so elegantly done and with so many nods to classic films. Even in the fight scene between Justin and Jenner at the end of the film, the sword fight scene, it's choreographed and blocked out like a real fight scene. They didn't cheat the action with a lot of editing. They really wanted you to believe these two characters are really whacking each other with swords, and that the impacts have weight. Now, are there some things about The Secret of Nimh that I don't really like? Sure. I mean, as much realism of technique that they tried to bring into the film, Bluth still knew the Disney way of breaking down a story to reach a larger audience. And in the case of comparing this film to the book, quite a few changes were made. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh the book has a lot more to do with the rats and their time at Nimh. There's no magic in the story. Jeremy the Crow is not a comic foil like he is in the film. He's actually a very simple character. I can also understand why Jeremy the Crow was made into a comic foil, because it does help lighten the mood a little. And Secret of Nimh is a very serious, dark film. And the little touches of comedy, they do help. Jenner the traitor is not a character in the book, really. He is mentioned in a story. And I would also say that the scenes with the Council of Rats, the rats themselves sort of seem like goofy bureaucrats, with the exception of the lead characters, of course. And there's also the business of giving Mrs. Brisby a magical amulet that allows her to unleash the power of her love at the end of the story to save her children. I'm not crazy about it, but I also can understand why they did it, because in the book, Mrs. Frisby doesn't really have any victories in the story. She's not the one who saves her kids, the rats do. And they wanted her to be heroic. So the amulet, it's kind of a goofy plot point, but nonetheless, it does allow for an emotional ending to the story that is satisfying, even if it's obviously contrived. But it's really hard for me to think of too many other animated movies that are such a loving example of the film genre and so self-aware in its execution. An example of that self-awareness is my favorite line in the film, and it might be my favorite line in any animated film, is when Mrs. Brisby is brought down to the Rat's Kingdom and she's seeing all these amazing things. And she apologizes to Justin, I think, for, acting like a fish out of water. And Justin says to her, he says something like, "You'll have to excuse us. We tend to take ourselves a little too seriously." It's just such a great film moment. So what are some of your favorite underappreciated animated films? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, hit the like button and subscribe. And think about becoming a patron of the new show, because I could use your help. Alright, this is Random Rob for the new show. Till next time, take care.